Matt, before I get to Mike Cannon-Brookes and the takeover, noting that you're slightly late this morning, are you blaming the unions? What's going on? Are you going to strike a deal with the unions?
Look, obviously we need to work through these issues. Our frontline workers do an amazing job, but we need to ensure that we get the best result for taxpayers and get the best result for those workers. We're working through these issues as we speak, and I want to make sure that we find the right way forward in everyone's interests.
No trains at all in Sydney. That's pretty extreme. What's going on?
Look, it's disappointing that the unions took this action. That said, we want to make sure that we work through the issues that have been raised to get the best result for the citizens of this state. Now, obviously, we're in very tight financial situation at the moment because of COVID. Our state's finances are in a very difficult space. That said, we know that inflation is on the horizon and those workers will obviously want to make sure their pay keeps up with it. So we need to work through these complex issues. They're not easy, but today's industrial action certainly wasn't helpful and wasn't the way to get the result.
Okay, let's talk about AGL and the bid from Mike Cannon-Brookes. Do you welcome this takeover move from Mike Cannon-Brookes?
Look, this is a private transaction. These are commercial decisions and obviously we're not going to get involved in those matters. But what I will say is that whoever owns those assets, the New South Wales government will work with them to ensure that we can put downward pressure on power prices and we keep the system reliable. That's what our plan has always been, and it doesn't matter who owns the assets. That's what our focus is.
If Mike Cannon-Brookes was to be successful, it would accelerate the end of coal by about 12 years in New South Wales. What would that do to the market, and would the capacity be able to be filled?
Well, I haven't seen what Mike Cannon-Brookes is proposing, but what I will say is that New South Wales has 5 coal-fired power stations. 2 of those, being Liddell and now Eraring, have said that they will be exiting in the next few years. That means we have 3 left. 1 of those is owned by AGL. If those power stations close before 2030, then the New South Wales government will have a big challenge on its hands to ensure that we build the replacement capacity. Now, fortunately for us here in this state, we have an energy policy. That's an energy policy that will ensure that we can drive the development of new electricity generation into the system. And we know that that's the most important way that we can not only keep the lights on, but also put downward pressure on prices. So we stand by our policy. It's a strong policy. It's got multi-party support, and the market is responding. Just that last week, Laura, we closed expressions of interest for our Hunter Central Coast renewable energy zone. We had 40 gigawatts of interest expressed by the private sector, worth up to $100 billion worth of private capital. So this is not taxpayer dollars, this is the private sector responding, because this is exactly where the market is moving to.
This is now looking like a more disorderly exit of coal from the market. It seems like every couple of months we have a surprise move, a closure being pulled forward. Wouldn't it be better if the government could give a stronger signal to the market, a stronger, clearer policy signal? And I'm talking perhaps at a federal level, a date of perhaps ending coal.
Well, look, I'm not a federal MP. Obviously, my views are very well known on the public record. It would be far better if we had a national energy policy that would coordinate the build of new infrastructure and the exit of existing infrastructure. But we've got that policy here in New South Wales, and my responsibility is to the New South Wales families and businesses. And that policy here in this state will help manage that transition from older technology to newer technology. And the market is voting with its feet. They're responding to our policy. In the New England, we've seen $100 billion of private investment coming forward. In the Hunter, we've seen $100 billion of private investment coming forward. In the New England, we've seen about $40 billion worth of private investment coming forward. And in the Central West Arana region, we've again seen tens of billions of private capital coming forward to build the new infrastructure. So there's no shortage in interest in the private sector to build dispatchable capacity into the system. But what we need to do is make sure that's coordinated across the nation.
Okay, but it doesn't seem that coordinated at the moment. And households are rightly concerned about volatility, not only in their bills and what they might be paying for electricity in the years ahead, but they could see potentially blackouts like they've seen in Europe as Europe moved towards renewable. Can you guarantee that those two things won't happen?
Well, yes, of course we can. That's why we've worked with the Australian Energy Market Operator to make sure that our plan to deal with the closure of the Eraring power station is going to see enough electricity in the system to keep the lights on. And that's exactly what the experts and the engineers who run our electricity system have said. So this is not politicians saying that we're going to guarantee reliability with the closure of Eraring. This is the engineers who run the nation's energy system. And they've said that there will be enough supply available in the system to ensure we keep the lights on. With regard to prices, obviously the exit of Eraring is going to put pressure on prices, but the best way to put downward pressure on prices is to build new generation, to build new supply. We've got a mechanism to do that here in New South Wales. It's our electricity infrastructure roadmap, and we'll be certainly speeding up or accelerating the build of new infrastructure in time for the closure of Eraring to ensure that we do put that downward pressure on electricity prices.
Okay, but at the start of this, you guaranteed no price hike and no blackouts. Is that right?
Well, what I guaranteed is that we've got a plan that will ensure that we keep the lights on. That's a plan that's been endorsed by AEMO, the Australian Energy Market Operator, the independent engineers that run the electricity system. And we also have a plan to put downward pressure on electricity prices. It's our electricity infrastructure roadmap. So I can guarantee that New South Wales has a plan in place to make sure that we keep the lights on and drive power prices down, Laura.
What do you say to Mike Cannon-Brookes' critics that say he's potentially virtue signalling here, that he's a climate activist?
Well, Mike Cannon-Brookes is a capitalist, and whilst he may want to see a cleaner environment, he also wants to make money. So let's not forget Mike Cannon-Brookes is not doing this out of the goodness of his heart. He's doing this because he thinks that there is a market here. He thinks that he can get a return on his investment. And that's why he's suggesting that he wants to build new infrastructure and take over the old infrastructure. So again, these are matters for the private market. The private sector is moving in this direction, and Mike Cannon-Brookes is one of many proponents that is looking to get on board the transition to a cheaper, cleaner, more reliable electricity future.
Would you give Mike Cannon-Brookes, if he was successful, any subsidies, any government assistance?
Well, Mike Cannon-Brookes is not asking for any subsidies or government assistance, and I think that's the thing. Well, if he did, we'd obviously we're not going to have those discussions unless there's a need to provide reliable and affordable electricity for the citizens of this state. And let me tell you very clearly, my understanding is Mike Cannon-Brookes is putting this offer forward because he thinks that he doesn't need any subsidies, he doesn't need any assistance. He's putting his own money behind this proposal because he thinks he can get a return on that investment. And just like any private investor, they're taking...
New South Wales taxpayers probably wouldn't look too kindly to subsidising a billionaire, would they?
Well, that's exactly right, and nor should we. What we should be doing is focusing on making sure that we've got the policy settings in place to guarantee reliable, affordable electricity, and that's what we have here in New South Wales.